At Benwater Prison in Colorado, there was an inmate named Ray Breslin, known to be extremely dangerous. This was because he always managed to escape, even when held in the most secure prisons in the world. Nearly every type of iron bars had been broken through by him without significant difficulty. His identity was also always kept secret by constantly changing his name. But how did it all begin? This is his story. The film opens with Breslin carefully putting a plan together. His cell neighbor then warns him to stay alert, as a group of inmates are planning to attack him without mercy the next day. But Breslin responds calmly, as if he already knew. When yard time comes, several prisoners are seen drawing weapons. Already prepared, Breslin steps forward first and quickly takes down his attackers. The guards rush in and immediately order all the inmates to lie down. Because of the incident, Breslin is punished by being moved to solitary confinement. As he walks, he studies the room's details while crafting a new plan, taking note of everything from the number of guards to the tools they use. For days afterward, Breslin continues calculating every possible outcome. He eventually notices the guards have a habit of smoking outside. This would become a critical part of his now maturing plan. After receiving his lunch, Breslin rolls a tissue into a compact ball. He also carefully tears apart a milk carton wrapper with precision. At the scheduled time, once returned to his cell, Breslin asks what time it is. He then begins counting in sync with the guards relaxing outside. Meanwhile, a woman has just arrived in the parking lot. Moments later, her car explodes, triggering panic. The guards quickly respond to assess the situation. But by then, Breslin has already vanished from his solitary cell. Without anyone noticing, he slips out from a fire truck and transfers to another vehicle. In the end, he successfully escapes, using nothing but his intelligence. In the car, Breslin is picked up by two of his teammates. It turns out they had all been working together to break out of the prison. Soon after, Breslin is dropped off at a roadside and promptly calls someone. Police vehicles arrive shortly, and Breslin surrenders without resistance. Moments later, a man shows up to explain the situation to the police. At the police station, the head warden demands to know what really happened. A man named Lester, who turns out to be Breslin's manager, introduces himself. He explains that they are part of a security agency contracted by the government to test prison systems. Breslin has broken out of nearly all of them so the weaknesses could be identified and fixed. The warden then asks how exactly Breslin managed to escape. Breslin explains there are three key elements: layout, routine, and help. At Benwater, the main weakness lay in the isolation unit being located next to the fire response room. The guards also had a consistent habit of smoking outside for 7 minutes. With that knowledge, all he needed next was the cell door code. To obtain it, Breslin used the milk carton wrapper's layer, pressing it against the keypad to capture the code. Once the door opened while the guard was away, he quickly moved to the fire response room. With the distraction in place, Breslin changed vehicles without delay. The warden could only stare in disbelief at how Breslin had outsmarted his prison. A few days later, Breslin returned to the office after 6 months of working undercover in prison. This time, they were visited by a guest named Jessica Meyer from the National Intelligence Agency. Jessica said she wanted Breslin to test a prison, its location strictly confidential, as it was designated for housing international political prisoners. Jessica was willing to pay any amount, as long as Breslin agreed. But there was one condition: he could not receive any help from his team. This meant Breslin would have no contact with the outside world until he escaped from there on his own. Realizing the risk was too great, Abigail strongly objected. Hush, too, refused to gamble with Breslin's safety, especially since the prison was unofficial and lacked international legal protection. Despite their concerns, Breslin agreed to take the mission. Jessica then handed over the coordinates and the exact time for his pickup. At the designated time, Abigail and Hush read out Breslin's new prison identity. They also secretly implanted a GPS chip into his arm. And most importantly, they gave him an emergency extraction code, in case anything went off plan. Moments later, Breslin gave a distant farewell. A car then arrived and shocked him violently with a taser. The GPS chip was ripped out, and Breslin passed out. In a half-conscious state, he witnessed another prisoner being stabbed with a knife. He was then thrown from a helicopter mid-flight. A moment later, Breslin was injected with something that pulled him back into darkness. When he regained consciousness, Breslin found himself inside his new prison. Each cell was oddly constructed, entirely out of glass. Hundreds of inmates were being held under extreme surveillance, guarded by heavily armed personnel. They were also watched by orb-shaped cameras monitoring their every move. Moments later, Breslin was taken into an interrogation room, where the warden introduced himself as Hobbs. Suspicious, Breslin recited his emergency code, requesting immediate release. But Hobbs replied coldly that no one who enters this place is ever allowed to leave. From their individual cells, the inmates were herded through stairwells into a corridor. Breslin began memorizing the prison's strange architecture. Eventually, they reached the ground level where all inmates were gathered together. Shortly after, a prisoner was dragged into the middle of the yard by the guards. After a brutal beating, he was left there without any help. Meanwhile, Breslin was suddenly attacked by a group of senior inmates. Luckily, they were stopped by a middle-aged man. His name was Emil Rotmeyer, and he tried to introduce himself to Breslin. But Breslin refused, not wanting to risk exposing his true identity. Back in his office, Hobbs was approached by one of his subordinates, a man named Drake, the head of security. Hobbs scolded him for acting without orders, specifically for killing a prisoner inside the helicopter during transit. As a consequence, Drake's pay would be docked based on the estimated value of the prisoner he killed. The following day, Breslin began studying the prison layout. His actions didn't go unnoticed. Emil observed him from afar. During yard time, Emil approached Breslin again, offering his help. He also explained that only devout Muslims were allowed to practice their faith inside this place. For several days, Breslin continued his observations. But he needed to access solitary confinement to learn more. Hearing this, Emil suddenly punched Breslin in the middle of the yard. The two began fighting each other until the guards rushed in. Without delay, both were thrown into solitary. A blindingly bright light was then turned on, leaving them disoriented and overheating. Meanwhile, back at their office, Abigail and Hush still couldn't locate where Breslin was being held. This made them increasingly worried, fearing that something bad might have happened to him. As a result, they pressured Lester to contact Jessica at the National Intelligence Agency. Once Breslin's time in solitary was over, a doctor was brought in to check his health. Breslin then stated that a doctor should never be involved in illegal operations. Feeling offended, the doctor had no response. Breslin went on to ask where the prison was located. But the doctor stayed silent and walked away. Back in the yard, Breslin still had no clue where he was. But he had a plan and asked Emil to find him a metal disc. Emil agreed and passed a message to Hobbs through one of the guards. Later, Emil was brought to the interrogation room. Hobbs immediately asked about the whereabouts of his boss, Victor Mannheim, a wanted fugitive. Emil, who used to be Mannheim's right-hand man in a communist uprising, was now a potential lead. However, Emil calmly stalled for time, frustrating Hobbs. Enraged, Hobbs ordered the guards to torture him. Emil used this moment to secretly steal a vent cover. With what they needed in hand, Breslin laid out the next phase of their plan. He suspected the prison was built underground. That would explain the vertical layout and damp air. Therefore, the only way out was to go upward, to the surface. That meant returning to solitary, because beneath its floor was a utility shaft. Without delay, Emil approached Javed, the leader of the Muslims in the prison. He insulted Javed's mother, causing a brawl to erupt. The guards quickly intervened and threw them into solitary. Once the lights were turned on, Breslin began heating the floor bolts. Hobbs, from his monitor room, kept a close eye on all inmates. After removing every bolt, Emil pretended to scream in pain to divert attention. Breslin disabled the CCTV and swiftly slipped down the opening. Watching Emil's outburst, a frustrated Hobbs stormed off toward solitary. Meanwhile, a technician reported that one of the cameras had gone dark and needed to be rebooted. Below, Breslin tried to open a door, but it wouldn't budge. He looked for another way and climbed into a water shaft leading upward. Meanwhile, Emil kept rambling like a madman to keep Hobbs distracted. But suddenly, Breslin accidentally snapped a cable, causing a leak. He rushed upward and finally pushed open a hatch to the surface. To his shock, he found himself on a massive ship, floating in the middle of the ocean. That meant the prison was constantly moving, its location impossible to trace. Once Emil calmed down, Hobbs returned and shut his cell door. Breslin, on the other hand, lost his grip and fell hard on his way back down. The water spilling from the shaft triggered an alarm. Guards immediately began evacuating the prisoners from their cells. Using all his strength, Breslin managed to return to his cell and seal the floor hatch just in time. His cell door was then flung open, and he was dragged out. At the office, Lester tried to reassure his subordinates to stay calm. He said he would do everything he could to ensure Breslin's release. Meanwhile, at the prison, Warden Hobbs found something odd in the solitary confinement cell. Several rusty bolts had been pulled out and were scattered on the floor. Realizing who was behind it, Hobbs contacted one of his connections, none other than Lester himself, who had deliberately arranged for Breslin to be imprisoned. Hobbs complained that Breslin was threatening the security of the facility. However, Lester insisted that Breslin must remain locked up, as someone had paid a hefty sum to keep him there. Furthermore, he instructed Hobbs to pressure Emile into revealing the location of his boss, since only Emile knew where the fugitive was hiding. Aware of Emile and Breslin's growing bond, Hobbs ordered Drake to break their spirit. From then on, Drake visited Breslin daily to torture him. He was given no peace and no time to regroup. Repeatedly, he had to be treated by the doctor just to stay alive through the suffering. During their rare moments alone, Emile continued to encourage him, saying they must not die in vain. Meanwhile, Abigail and Hush worked tirelessly to track him down. At last, they uncovered a piece of intel pointing to a prison in the middle of the ocean. Now that Breslin knew the facility was on a ship, he began analyzing the guards' routines. Their habits gave clues to the time of day, when it was day and when it was night. The next step was to determine where the ship was sailing. To do that, he had to meet the doctor again and ask for help. To make this happen, Emile stabbed Breslin in the thigh with a small blade, forcing the guards to take him to the infirmary. Unfortunately, the doctor refused to talk, afraid of what might happen if he did. Breslin then faked a collapse and secretly pocketed several documents. Since that plan failed, they moved on to the next. Breslin crafted a makeshift sextant using basic materials, a device that could estimate their location by measuring the position of stars on the horizon. Seeing the two still spending time together, Hobbs issued a new order to the guards. Breslin was moved to a different cell, separating him from Emile. Hobbs informed him that he would no longer be allowed out into the yard. Not wanting the plan to fall apart, Breslin offered a deal. He claimed that Emile now trusted him completely, and getting Victor's location would be easy. Once back in the yard, Breslin told Emile what had happened. He asked him to recruit Javid to join their plan. While Breslin fed false information daily to the prison authorities, Emile gradually won Javid over. A few days later, Javid was brought into the interrogation room. He reported that a group of inmates was planning an escape. But he refused to say more unless Hobbs met his request. He wanted to pray and worship while looking up at the open sky. That night, under the cover of darkness, Javid finally had the chance to gaze at the night sky. He knelt in prayer and quietly prepared the star measuring device. Once the coast was clear, he discreetly aligned the tool with the stars above. After handing over the results, Breslin reviewed all the laws of geophysics he could recall. Eventually, he concluded that they were somewhere in the North Atlantic Ocean, specifically off the coast of Morocco, near the capital city of Casablanca. Upon hearing this, Emile mentioned that he had contacts who might be able to help them. The problem now was how to send a message to the outside world. With careful psychological manipulation, Breslin returned to the infirmary to confront the doctor. He questioned the morality of the doctor's involvement in such illegal activities. Breslin's words struck a nerve, causing the doctor to reflect on his actions. Troubled, the doctor reread the Hippocratic Oath in his notebook that night. The next day, he confessed that he was only involved out of fear and that he truly wanted out. Eventually, he agreed to offer some assistance. That night, Breslin launched the final stage of their plan. He fed Hobbs a false lead, claiming that Emile's boss, Victor, was hiding in Bulgaria. At the same time, Javid reported that Breslin was planning to escape at dawn. Meanwhile, the doctor began typing an emergency message and sent it to one of Emile's contacts in Casablanca. Once Hobbs deployed a strike team to Bulgaria, he also ordered the guards to stay on high alert. He translated Breslin's tapping code on the cell windows, suspecting that messages were being spread. At daybreak, Javid initiated a commotion. Fights broke out among the prisoners, overwhelming the guards. Hobbs watched the chaos unfold with rising panic as the situation spiraled out of control. The guards fired tear gas to regain control. Meanwhile, the trio made their move, rushing up the stairs and knocking out any guards in their path. They had 11 minutes left before reinforcements arrived. Breslin disabled the CCTV system to obscure their movements. On his monitors, Hobbs could only watch helplessly as they advanced. Without hesitation, they climbed the final stairwell toward the surface. But Hobbs ordered all exits locked. Every path was sealed, trapping them inside. With only 8 minutes left, a helicopter took off from Casablanca. Hobbs ordered Drake and the guards to intercept the fugitives. Breslin then led the others toward the control room to shut down the security systems. But soon, a wave of guards arrived, guns blazing. In the firefight, Javed was hit and had to be carried to cover. Drake ordered his men to breach the control room door while he circled around to flank them. Breslin realized then, they were being tracked by motion detectors. Seeing Javed's severe injuries, Breslin knew he wouldn't survive the descent. He asked them to hold the stairwell while he continued on alone. As Breslin left, Javed refused to let Emil carry him further. Knowing he wouldn't make it, Javed chose to make the ultimate sacrifice. Meanwhile, the rescue helicopter was still struggling to locate the moving prison ship, with only moments left. Summoning all his courage, Javed opened fire on the approaching guards. He was shot multiple times but kept fighting until he finally collapsed. When Hobbs arrived, he ended Javed's life without mercy. On the lower deck, Drake chased after Breslin, who was running through the narrow corridors. The two clashed in a brutal fight. Though Breslin fought valiantly, he was eventually overpowered and beaten badly. But just as defeat seemed certain, he gathered his strength, retaliated fiercely, and managed to shove Drake off the stairs, sending him plunging to his death. Breslin then rushed toward the ship's engine room and shut down the main power supply, causing the entire security system to fail. At that moment, Emil managed to unlock the exit leading to the upper deck. At the same time, the rescue helicopter finally arrived, opening fire on the crew and the ship's officers. Emil sprinted toward the extraction point, but guards poured in from all directions to surround him. The helicopter pilots laid down covering fire, holding the enemies at bay while Emil approached. Back in the engine room, Hobbs had arrived, cutting off Breslin's escape. With no way out, Breslin changed his plan and hid inside a water tank. Emil, now at the helicopter, took control of the mounted gun and rained fire on the guards, thinning their numbers. As Breslin stayed hidden, Hobbs scoured every corner of the engine room, demanding that Breslin come out and face his inevitable death. Meanwhile, Emil realized they couldn't hold the position much longer. Left with no choice, he reluctantly took off, leaving his friend behind. When the power was restored, the automated systems resumed, and the water tank began to refill. Moments later, Breslin was flushed out into the open ocean. Spotting him in the water, Emil quickly lowered the helicopter for a daring rescue. Hobbs, realizing what was happening, stormed the deck and opened fire. As Breslin climbed the rope ladder, he called out for a weapon. Hobbs managed to hit Emil, but ran out of bullets before finishing the job. Seeing the opportunity, Breslin aimed at the ship's fuel tank and fired. The resulting explosion engulfed the vessel in a massive fireball. Upon reaching the shores of Casablanca, a black vehicle pulled up beside the survivors. A woman stepped out. It was Jessica. To Breslin's surprise, she was revealed to be Emil's daughter and an undercover agent within the National Intelligence Agency. Emil, it turned out, was none other than Victor Mannheim, having assumed a false identity all along. Shocked, Breslin listened as Jessica revealed the truth. Lester had betrayed them, siding with powerful government figures who wanted Breslin locked away forever. Days later, Abigail informed Breslin that Lester had gone missing, but his location had finally been traced. In a quiet parking lot, Lester climbed into a car, only to be drugged and rendered unconscious. When he awoke, he found himself trapped inside a shipping container aboard a vessel at sea.